to be here. Thanks, Florencia, for setting up this, because it's a really great series and I've enjoyed everybody's presentation. It's a very fun thing to do. So actually, I had the pleasure of doing 2 theses at school because I had an undergraduate thesis at Princeton, which was called Ideal Monsters, and it dealt with 2 things. The idea of kind of Vitruvius's dissections and Descartes' automated drawings of different robots. And the way in which this starts, and the second one was the Neimark thesis called The Soviet Aquatory and the Salad Barge. But what you'll notice throughout the presentation is there's always a kind of project that I'm working on that has to do with an idea about writing something, research, etc. It transitions into a design project, but always through the concept of a publication. So there will be these books that pop up that kind of frame the way in which these projects become public. So the first one was published in Sexy Machinery, which is a small journal out of the UK. And then the second one also became later a publication in Future Interior. So I'll spend a little bit more time on the thesis, and then I'll jump through a lot of the practice because that is much more familiar. This one, the Soviet Aquatory, was a project I did. So this advisor is Michael Meredith at the GSD. I finished in 2007. And I looked at the way in which the Soviet infrastructure of water connected 2 major cities, St. Petersburg and Moscow. And in a way, it was a bit of a farce. As you see Stalin checking out, Borat's ass. But it's a kind of an idea about what to do with this forgotten concrete infrastructure. The thesis is such: Soviets ate roots, Russians eat leaves. And so the idea is that, during the Soviet regime, when the climate was quite harsh, everybody ate only beets, radishes, onions, potatoes, etc. And of course, during the Russian time, a kind of political regime brings with it a whole different harvest of things. And so architectural infrastructure begins to participate. And so I looked closely at different scales of water as it moves through the urban landscape, but also at the kind of historic photographs. These are by Alexander Rodchenko, when he looks into the construction by the Gulag, the forced labor camps that constructed some of the water stairs and canal systems that connect, because of course, Russia is mostly landlocked. And so all of this infrastructure was artificial. So this is an idea about thinking through how renderings, how labor changes the landscape, but also changes our understanding of this kind of political landscape. What I proposed was a hydraulic infrastructure for hydroponic farming. And so this is really an attempt to understand the scale of the farm in relationship to the scale of a kind of public space of the boat, of the barge. And so these things kind of flowed from city to city, bringing with them an idea about produce market, et cetera, et cetera. This is the leaves part of the Russian kind of new elite. So a very kind of tongue-in-cheek, but developed through a series of models that were displayed at Gunhole. Now, when I finished, I went to work for OMA. And then also when I moved to Los Angeles for Johnston Markley. And so some of the works, I think many of you know the Nagelberg House, which is also the Vault House, I guess known as the Vault House by Johnston Markley. That was a project that I worked on with Mark and Sharon. But similar to now, the time when I finished was 2007 for the Neimark one. So by 2009, the work was really not there anymore. So it was an opportunity to kind of reconnect back with my thesis and reestablish an idea about how this actually travels back into publication and into exhibition world. So at this time, I started teaching at USC, and I worked on an exhibition also made out of foam. So this is like a theme, I guess, in the work, because of course the exhibition now at SCI-Arc still standing, and I need to take it down in the next 2 weeks, but it's another form of foam construction. So this was an idea about taking those maps that I had drawn in thesis and kind of thinking of them as projected into the space of the gallery through a series of EPS foam models. At the time, I also started working with Andrew Atwood. And in fact, in some of these pictures, you see the back of the head of John May, These are friends whom I met, Andrew in school and John here in LA. And we were working on a lot of these initial projects together. Somehow the kind of extruded foam models became cities. They became kind of infinite plans. They became kind of proposals for competitions. And also a kind of first project as a kind of starting point for first office was this idea of extrusion of different kind of paintings by Malevich, so the white on white studies, etc. And really this is kind of where the office kind of began to take hold. The idea of kind of working through exhibition, design, and then publication kind of really takes, each kind of chapter takes it full circle. And so the kinds of covers that I'm showing, I really tried to publish in different places. So for example, places like Log, Perspecta Project, all the journals that we all read, Praxis, etc. So those are the kinds of things that pop up. We got really excited when I found this, we found this image of La Vedette, which is a house by Viollet-le-Duc. And so we had a period where we only worked on mountains, whether they were painted or extruded or built. This is my collaborator, Andrew Atwood. He's a professor at Berkeley. And thinking about also ways in which kind of painted environments and digital meet. So of course, a lot of these were very self-referential projects about rendering and specifying. And these were some of the spec books that we were writing. And I think that a lot of this work is going to look familiar, if not for the students who have kind of engaged in it, but also for the fact that a lot of the stuff that we were developing as part of these exhibitions, we also kind of, I brought it into SCI-Arc as part of like core curricular kind of questions and techniques. And so a lot of the stuff is almost like too familiar perhaps at this point, because we all deal with things like specifying paint and specifying kind of joinery and different kinds of things like that. The Shotgun House project, I think, was important for us as well, for that reason, that we were able to think of kind of way of applying formalism, but at a very small scale. So this is really a project about molding and what it can do, the way it folds into spaces, and in collaboration, of course, with the Art Expo in Chicago. So ways in which kind of art enters architecture. And so in many ways, I think the practice has been characterized as an art practice within the field of architecture. But I think that at the same time, we're trying to kind of break out of that very limited position. I've been trying to write an essay this summer, which many of you will know, Rosalind Krause's essay called Architecture in the Expanded, or Sculpture in the Expanded Field. I'm trying to write something that's called Architecture in the Shrunken Field, because I think that's what, in a way, we've done with the first office. We've kind of shrunken certain problems to the size of a gallery, and we're trying now to bring those things back out into the space of construction and doing a lot more residential work. So this is a small art studio in Virginia. We're working on ADU right now here in LA. And of course, you're all familiar with the project that's currently on view still at SCI-Arc. And you know, this kind of comes full circle. You see that the kind of interest in the research and going to the archives, bringing kind of historic material to the foreground in relationship to models, in relationship to this kind of physical facture, the kind of material specification of every single detail is kind of on display here. It's a kind of, I mean, for sure, fetishism of all those things working together. This is our team for that project. Rob is probably here. Hello, and Ben, very good friend, and Austin, all three alums of SCI-Arc, or soon to be alums, and that's where we're at. Thank you.
That's a great photo. Thank you, Anna. Okay, so you have 57 seconds. So
oh, I do.
Yes.
I give them over to you, Florencia.
Thank you. Thank you. I'll use them. Okay, so if you stop share, I'll start sharing.
I don't know where. I will try, but I lost my screen. Can you stop me from sharing?
No, I need you to, first, I think you have to maybe.
Aha.
Yeah, there we go.
Thank you.
Okay, so let me see if you see, do you see my full screen? Yes. Sorry, Faris, can you see my full screen? This is fluent?
Yeah,
okay.
Yeah, we see it.
Okay, so I'm going to start. Okay, so I better do good on time. So I just, you know, thank you for being here. So unfortunately, I didn't have a thesis. There was no thesis. I went to the University of Rosario School of Architecture and Urban Design. I mean, strong urban design component. And we have no thesis. I went to Columbia and there's no thesis. So I had no thesis. I only had studios and final studios. So I ended up with a studio, which means that I did somebody's thesis, but I didn't do my own thesis. So what I want to show today is that I had to figure out how to build up a thesis. So I think that what I'm going to show, it made a thesis. And I call it, it's a thesis in 3 acts. So I'm going to show the 3 acts. They span many years. So this is, you know, this is for the students. The benefit of really having a thesis is quite huge. I mean, I say that from experience. So the first act is my final, one of the final projects. When I was doing the final studio in Rosario, I took a class in Buenos Aires in '97 in the Museo de la Cárcova. The Museo de la Cárcova was a school, a museum of art of replicas, of classic replicas, but the professor at that time who had worked for Enrique Miralles, who did, you can see the old museum, the Art Nouveau Museum, and this kind of addition at the front entry and a ramp and certain things. So he had the museum to kind of do workshops. So me and my friends, some of my friends, we took the class in Buenos Aires. So the Cárcova was a special place. It was slightly different than going, you know, my huge school that I went to. So being in Buenos Aires was really different. I mean, remember, this is '97, there's no Google, there's no email, there's nothing. So, so the one thing you have is that you have to do research, real research. You have to either go places, you have to use the library. And so what I did was to look into the old map archive of the city of Buenos Aires and started looking at the actual physical old maps of Buenos Aires. Remember that my education in my undergrad it has had a lot of an urban design component. So for me, looking at territories was quite relevant. So in these old maps, you know, you had to create this was like a micro thesis, I would say. I had to invent a project, I had to invent a program, and I had to find the site. So the maps helped me to find the site. This is Buenos Aires. In the center is the fort. I cannot use a pointer, but in the center is the old fort with the original grid. And if you go to the left side, you see that river is called the Riachuelo. So the site that I chose was the Riachuelo. This is the Riachuelo, which is La Boca. It's a place that is very touristy. La Boca is also where the big soccer stadium is, where Maradona started his career. If I would point it out, you will see it to the left is the La Boca, and the Riachuelo was interesting because it separated the land and created this unique neighborhood, but it was crisscrossed by freeways. So always looking up from the top and finding features, finding geometries. I was interested in the way in which the old grid, the new grid, the landscape, the topography was matching with the freeway system. You know, as you can see how freeways, you know, in kind of very authoritarian regimes in Argentina really cuts through cities. So I went back to the office and I found the original drawings, the hand-drawn drawings of the project. And the idea for the project was to take on the curves and the features of those freeways and create a delay, you know, like a loop, like a fake loop. So the project, as you see, it makes you, as you run through that, you had to exit, but always come back to the freeway. So the idea is that it made a knot, a delay. It makes you, it had observation decks. So the points that look at the city are observation decks. And so in a way, you were forced to either, you could either continue, you can, you know, so the project really didn't have any program. It's just, it was a kind of an exercise on geometry, on profiles, on curves, and then it kind of created a feature within that context, which was between industrial and, you know, and kind of traditional in Buenos Aires. Everything done. I also found at the office my rotring, my original rotring, I don't know how you say, compass that I used to actually make these drawings. This is a copy, this is a Xerox copy. Okay, I have to be true to my time, I go fast. Then I had an intermission, I moved to the United States, and I worked for Peter Eisenman, for Eisenman Architects from 98 to 99. I'm not going to show any projects of that. And so it came Act 2, I went to Columbia, 2000, 2001. And I studied at Avery. Avery is also, is the biggest, the largest library of architecture books. So it's a wonderful, like the School of Architecture takes room in the library, like it borrows spaces from the library, but this is the library building. So that's also fantastic about Columbia. Always the classes are really small because the library takes over. So I found a book that for me was fundamental for, you know, for much of that time there, I would say, which is the Paolo Portuguesi, sorry, Elena, my pronunciation, a book on Borromini, and his studies on geometry. So again, in an issue of speed, I'm just going to go fast in how that was kind of bringing back some of those geometries that I studied in La Cárcova in Buenos Aires, and then started to look at how I could borrow certain methods of translation. Here, nothing made by hand. This is the beginning of the computer, and how the, you know, the line starts to proliferate and transform. So now somehow I had more freedom, but at the same time, I needed some constraints. In parallel to that, I look at another book. So in a way, books were always the relevance, either going through archives, looking through books, but finding a way in which the driver was out there. So the Arcades project, the Walter Benjamin incomplete book, was relevant at kind of looking at building up the project. This is a studio that I did with Alejandro Saera Polo. My main faculty were, you know, this is my last studio in Columbia. So the idea of carving out space is, you know, working with Alejandro is quite tough in the sense that everything has to be argued, everything has to be found within the typology of architecture. So for me, the arcade and Borromini's geometrical studies created the combination for that project. I wanted to show this. It's a pity that I could not find, as Margaret then told me. I did, my main software was Maya and Flash when I was a student at Columbia. Flash was the thing that I discovered myself. And I cannot open any of those files. I just wanted to show, I also wanted to show where these files are from. This is September 18, 2001. At the beginning, when I started the studio, this is when September 11 happened in New York. So I tried to find the September 11 file. I couldn't find. It seems that I didn't work that day, but it seems that I worked on that a few days right after that, almost as if there was really not a stop. I think even we had a pin-up on that Monday. The second intermission was like, in a way I finished school. So the next projects, then I worked for offices. I worked in New York for Asymptote in 2001. I worked for Greg Lynn Forms from 2002 to 2006. This is where I met Elena and Shaki. And then I worked on a project with Greg Lynn and Frank Getty in 2006. So I think that from that time, I just wanted to show these two projects. That is like Greg Lynn's ARC project and then Frank Getty's Sentosa project. Siri is writing down what I say. So yeah, I don't know how to stop. Well, anyway, so these two projects were quite fundamental within that time. But again, I'm just going to go fast because no, Siri, hold on, okay, she's gone. So the final act, which for me closest my thesis, was SCI-Arc. I think that we talked with Elena in 2006. This is the SCI-Arc of Eric Moss. nothing on the left, nothing on the side, on the right, empty, you know, no Santa Fe, no new buildings, just a building there, no signs, nobody knew what this building was, but it had an amazing gallery and an incredible school. So this is the kind of landscape of that SCI-Arc of the 2006. And Eric, you know, just chatting with Eric, I had an idea about a project I was working on, and he said, why don't you do an exhibit at SCI-Arc 2006? This was really early. I said, of course. So this was my exhibition at SCI-Arc. It was called, okay, now I have to, that's my timer. So this was my exhibit at SCI-Arc. The idea was that it took on those similar attitudes about curvature, about line, about material, about color, you know, now combining many years. So as you can see that you have almost 10 years until finally I got to do a thesis that for me, you know, the SCI-Arc exhibit was the thesis. And very cheap, you know, so material, and I know, everybody knows I have done an exhibit here, how materials and fabrication have to be simplified and streamlined. So throughout the years, just to get to today, quite fast, as the story goes, is that I started my own office as FP Mode, and I worked with Shaki as Pita Bloom. I also edited a log with Mark Gage in 2009. So work through project, this is through FP Mode, some projects. So things happened, lines happen, and then I'm here today, you know. So again, I have 1 minute for today. I cannot show this project because I have signed an NDA. So what I did is I shredded all the images. So it's like they're here, but they're not here. But it's under construction right now. So this is a project that I'm working on in New York right now. It's, you know, again, it's under construction. This is yesterday, 1 day and 1 minute ago inside. And the things that I have shredded the plans, I have shredded the studies, I have shredded, but just, you know, just a glimpse onto what's coming, where all of these things, they come back, you know, the idea of curve, the idea of materiality, you know, they do come back within that final project. Wow, 10 minutes is really short. Anyway, I did it, sorry, I had to. If I don't do 10 minutes, then I cannot give an alarm clock to anybody. Okay, that's it, thank you.
I go now?
Yes.
Okay. I'm like Florencia. I went to 2 schools that don't have thesis. I never did a thesis. And actually the 5th year of my undergraduate was, you had to do 2 semesters with a company called Urban Design Associates, which were kind of one of the early proponents of new urbanism. And we were doing stuff like this with like watercolor. And I knew that this wasn't what I wanted to do. So I actually, I studied abroad at SCI-Arc for a semester, so I wouldn't have to do a 2nd semester of this as my final. I drove across country, used my scholarship check from Carnegie Mellon to pay for a studio here at SCI-Arc, with Hernan actually, to make sure that I wouldn't have to do this anymore. And basically, but there were some good things about that happened there, and particularly we had like a great lecture series. And one of the most kind of formative or kind of critical lectures for me was a lecture by Jeff Kipnis about the, in 2003, I think, about the exhibition that he had just opened at the Wexner Center. I believe Marcelin actually worked on this exhibition as well, called Mood River. And one of the things that interests me the most about his lecture on the project was the way that they curated these design objects in the exhibition. He spoke a lot about these ideas of kind of flocking and some of the relationships within a complex system. Specifically, like I remember one of the things that he was really interested in was this thing called panic, which after I started getting more into the kind of theory behind complex systems, I think is actually more accurately described as drift. But this idea that he showed in the lecture this sequence of toothbrushes. I couldn't find any high-res images of the show, unfortunately. Sorry. But he had like a kind of layout of toothbrushes, and he showed like the progression of how like a little feature, like a little blue plastic thing on one, starts to migrate through the designers in that field. And so I became obsessed with systems of design. And I was operating in a kind of a vacuum there. at Carnegie Mellon, there wasn't a lot of discourse around that. Like there was even just some of the work that had been coming out of Columbia in the 90s was slowly starting to become like trickle in then. So often when I would present my work trying to work on these multi-agent systems, I would discuss it in the context of particle systems and the simulations and the animate form projects that Greg Lynn had been doing at Columbia, simply because it was the only work that the kind of faculty had any context or relation to. So it was a bit rough sledding. So I jumped in my car, drove to Los Angeles. By day, I believe Florencia one time remarked, she called this my dark history. But I worked for a firm called Graft for a few years. I worked for a few other firms. Coming from Carnegie Mellon, I didn't have a lot of connections in the city, so I kind of bounced around a little bit before I ended up at Graft. And this was pre housing crisis, and things were awesome. We were just like generating all kind of crazy bars and nightclubs and hotels and things that places that I would never actually drink myself, but I had a lot of fun drawing them. So by day I was doing work like this, but at night I was trying to begin to explore this idea of trying to formulate an architecture around the kind of multi-agent systems that Jeffrey Kepnes had referenced in the Mood River lecture, and I kind of delved in further on this idea of kind of the Latour's like actor-actant theories and John Holland's complex adaptive system theory. And some of these things were like formal exercises, so beginning to teach myself how to code like animated relationships between agents that had an awareness of their physicality in their bodies, so beyond just things of like kind of being a biomimetic flocking system. Some of these things were about this, like trying to really understand how like social phenomena spread through a population. So this is a simulation I did many years ago where these entities are actually playing prisoner's dilemma with each other and changing their behavior based on kind of a local scoring system or exchange of the social dialogue between each other. So this was a kind of more, this was the less explicitly like formal behavior in the system. And then doing some real, like looking at how these systems specifically would start to engage things outside of the computer. So this is a pretty rough looking AR app I made in Java, I think back in 2006, 7. A friend of mine said it looked like a snuff film. I probably should remake it at some point, but this was kind of what I was doing at night while I was making those kind of discotheques during the day. I knew that I wanted to, what's this? Okay, I knew that I wanted to find a way to figure out how these little experiments into behavioral systems and complex systems could start to become an architecture. And so I left my position at Graft. At the time, I thought that I would be returning to study at Columbia, which, as Florencia noted, doesn't have a thesis. And there's different ways of approaching, I think, the post-professional program at Columbia. The way that actually Renan advised me to do it was to kind of set a project for myself and then begin to test it against the agendas of my critics. And this project here was the kind of final project from Columbia. It was actually only like a 3-4 week project. It was in Enrique Walker's studio. And he was asking us to kind of push against the cliches of something. And I started looking at the cliches of kind of biomimetic architecture and the kind of rationalizations of structures, or the rationalization of performative structure as like the kind of justification for an aesthetics. And I was looking more at like how to produce from these kind of body systems I developed entities which were like more interested in kind of architectural things. So I was trying to make things that were volumetric and spatial from these interrelated bodies, but specifically looking at how they could start to learn like the logarithmic recurve of a Baroque spiral as part of the formal generation of this project. And again, like their behaviors would propagate through based on kind of similar logic and algorithms that I had used to create those population studies. And this project really stuck with me for a few years, and both kind of diagrammatically, but also as this kind of pursuit of trying to understand how to produce an architecture through an assemblage of figural bodies with self-awareness and only local understanding of formal production. The kind of formal, each one of these kind of parts is an agent, and each agent kind of reifies itself as a form based on what kind of mood it was in. Again, I was kind of ripping off I just borrowed, because I needed some kind of absurdist criteria, the mood classifications from the Mood River exhibit. When I I'm going to massively abbreviate what happened after Columbia. Like the economy was not good. I did not go back to graph. I worked for, I worked a lot of odd jobs. Garrett Ammerman, who is like a recent design theory pedagogy student, asked me to break down my career path, and afterwards he just kind of looked at me like sad and confused and said that's not useful for anyone. But at one point, some things started to stabilize. I started working with Roland Snooks, who also, you know, he was very interested in multi-agent systems and had done a lot to kind of promote their use. And this first project that we did together, I think, obviously, like very clearly evolved out of my final project at Columbia and the techniques I had developed there, but kind of through his own interest in this kind of more biomimetic thing. So like the fact that the bodies are subsumed into a singular kind of gelatinous mass with more of a kind of carved or cast figure was something that, you know, was much more in line with the way that Roland was thinking about the utilization of these systems as a kind of a surfactant, like this kind of decoration of a volume. So like even though the volume of this atrium was generated through the agent bodies, they were kind of more understood as this kind of condition along a solid surface versus the other ones. And like this one, which was kind of I did this one after kind of restarting Kinch as a design practice and not purely as a consulting practice, which is how I kept food in my mouth for a while, as a way of kind of drawing a line in the sand on that project. Like I wanted to kind of just push the things I was interested in that, in terms of how these bodies could begin to form threshold and structural systems and gradiated relationships between volume and mass and plan, and wasn't so much about surface, but was kind of more of a volumetric project. So those ideas, like the kind of the gap in there, and like how I began and maintained my office was applying this understanding of designing systems for design or designing platforms of design across a range of projects. And most of them I can't show because of NDAs, but you know, the same ideology that we used when I was consulting for Michelle Roischken's this department store on the left for the facade of this, was really similar conceptually in terms of the framework that I used for this simulation of the metro systems based on the real world ridership data from a server being updated every 5 minutes for the Audi Experiments and Motion project. So like using these networks to try to predict in some ways the way people might use thing. And I think that's it. Well, yeah, that's one more minute. Cool. And like a lot of the stuff I was doing in that time period, I can't show. Like I was doing a lot of work for Cecil Baumann, and he's pretty as a structural engineer writing kind of agent-based software for the AGU at the time, which was part of Arab. But the thing on the right is kind of just a little quick sketch I made from that using material simulation. The thing on the left was one of these worlds I used to build for Carl Chu. That stuff started to migrate into these kind of more image-based works. How I work with the robots, through like the robots autonomously designing, and you know, things like the architectural beast. So that lecture back in 2003 set a preoccupation with complex systems and relational systems, specifically in relational like theory that I haven't abandoned. Like it's been the kind of central focus of everything I've done since then. Okay.
Thank you, Casey. I love the first drawing you showed. That's an amazing arc, no, Christy?
I wonder if David Eskenazi had to do that. Like we had to do like because he was 4 years after me. I wonder if they were still having to do the watercolors. Like hated that.
It influenced the negative effect, you know, not that you pursue that. So thank you, guys. So I'd like to open to, yeah, not even in Italy, it's true. Like, so Philadelphia, Pittsburgh and Italy, you know, worlds apart. So I'd like to open, let me put it on gallery view. I'd like to open to any questions, any comments on the chat as well.
Florencia, I have a comment because I realized, well, Casey too, in some ways, we all started with this infrastructural projects. And I mean, Florencia, your work with the kind of curvature of the off-ramp, it's really interesting that somehow things kind of shifted maybe more now into parts and interiors, and in many ways the thesis, what we're calling kind of the initial work, was industrial and infrastructural in nature and urban.
Yeah, I had forgotten about that project, even that I went to La Carcova completely. So I just found the role, and then an old computer with like files. So so it's like I forgot, you know. So in a way, it's like you forget your own thesis, and then you just find the way back. But many of that stuff, the 6 years. My undergrad is 6 years. And it had a lot of infrastructure projects, Anna. So I think all the drawings you've shown from Russia and so on totally had were part of that education. So so when you start to invent one project, it begins with a freeway, I would say, you know, the cleanest curvature that you can find. But I think that there are a few other projects. I mean, now I realize how short it is, 10 minutes for all the stuff that we had to look through. No, and then try to edit down to put it into one PowerPoint. So that doesn't answer anything, but yes, there's a like urban micro to the micro project, like the final project that's mostly an interior. You know, the same concepts somehow come back. I just realized through this, making this PowerPoint.
Anna, I'm curious if you could talk a little bit more about your notion of the shrunken field. I thought that was kind of fascinating. The relationship between that shrunken field and then your more recent work where you say you're kind of pushing out of that again.
Hi, Marceline. Thank you. Well, it's really just that we've been working a lot with, we always kind of maybe celebrated this with art, with artists in collaborations, or with, you know, Mack Center, or with the Graham Foundation, or different biennials, and also in Chicago, and Architectural League, etc. So these are kind of amazing foundations, but always when we work within these spaces, the projects are quite small. So there's an idea of shrinking architecture to fit into the PS1 courtyard, or into a building in Chicago somewhere, you know, inside of like some sort of McMansion that the Graham occupies. And so the idea of shrinking architecture into bite-sized pieces to produce this kind of academic discourse, I think at some point it becomes quite obvious that we're not really working as architects in the city. And so this is kind of coming back to the initial question with Florencia, and even Casey to some degree. Like, I know that the new urbanism stuff looks cheesy, but to actually bring that architecture back out of the gallery and into the city is an incredibly important step. And I would say that for us, it's really what we're working on right now, to say that, you know, if Duchamp was like the guy who took the toilet and put it as a fountain into the gallery, we want to take that piece of the fountain and bring it back as a toilet into the field, right? So like, how do you take something that was very explicitly produced as an art practice or as an art project, but actually build it as part of our urban infrastructure, urban network? And it's like a very different set of audiences and a very different sets of budgets that would have to come into play, because of course we'd be dealing with very different kinds of institutions. But I think as young practices, we're all in the same kind of boat to balance these things.
I like glossed over a lot of stuff, like particularly like the immediate like 5 years after I graduated from Columbia, or 3 years. I actually think for me it was the inverse. One of the reasons I glossed over a bunch of stuff is there's just a lot of stuff I can't show. It's because the type of work I was doing was for I showed the example of that little like MTA installation, but it was much more about the developing systems for the city. Like it was very applied. Like I was working with financial companies, infrastructural companies, transportation companies. And it was actually the art project emerged from that. Like rather than it being a kind of internal disciplinary project, I think that the lessons I was learning from building systems for predicting how long it would take a garbage truck to get to a site and which dump was the best one to use was the kind of driving factor for me to kind of rethink what the critical mediums for design moving forward were, and why I needed to start to build a more art-driven or aesthetic project or design project around those media that are already kind of controlling the way the world works and the city works. So it's like rather than kind of taking something out into the city, it was like bringing the city into something that had maybe tried to bring it back into some kind of disciplinary impact.
Hi, I wanted to ask Florencia and Casey, since you didn't have thesis projects, kind of what you think the difference between like a capstone and a thesis project is, and kind of what we should be getting out of the idea of thesis, like what the opportunity might be in that, kind of a distinction between the project types.
I actually never had a capstone project either. I think maybe actually I think it's okay to not have thesis. I know a lot of great people that never had thesis. I know that it's part of the culture here, but I also know that, you know, I think the thesis at SCI-Arc is, in the way it's been kind of focused in the last couple of years as Florencia has taken over, is super productive. I think that there are a lot of other thesis studios at other institutions that have a maybe different structure, which seem to be less productive in terms of where it launches someone towards the rest of their career.
I wish I had a thesis, Christina, you know, I mean, it took me like 10 years to figure out an idea. So I do think that there's a, I mean, I would say at the beginning, I didn't completely believe in thesis, that you would force a project in such a fast manner. But I think that also it's just reflecting. I mean, it might take you more than 10 years to do it, you know, like to test it and things still linger, but at least you focus on something for 1 year. And then maybe it's a glimpse, you know, I know that, you know, you don't conclude something in September, but at least you have, you know, all the elements, you have the conversation, you're thinking in the long run. I do think that for Casey, you know, I see Casey all the stuff. I mean, actually, Casey was my student in SCI, I don't know, like how many thousand years ago. You know, like, you know, you build up by small increments. I think that this 16 years, yes, no need. I put the year so you guys could see also that not only I had a thesis in 10 years, but 97 is not the same thing as 2001, and then not the same thing as 2006. And the fact that as a thesis, I chose a software that is now obsolete, this is something that you guys have to think, you know, like I was so proud of being the Flash person at Columbia, like the only person that could like dominate Flash. I wish I had Margaret, helped me out to some of the files that I found. Everything was animated. I animated every single curve. It was a whole thesis. I cannot even open that today. So I think that you have to believe in the software, but you have to find what's beyond, you know, what kind of drawings you want to keep, you know. I emphasize so much the need to photograph with a professional photographer. In a way, I'm doing with you guys what I couldn't do with myself. Like good photos of the models, no matter what they are, good renders, not a software file, not something that you need a special computer and an archive in order to open, nothing. Just keep your images, keep your photos, keep the consistency of your ideas, catalog them, you know, the magazine, you just, where did you find? I could not find any of those maps that were so wonderful that I have found as a thesis research in Buenos Aires. None of them. So I Google stuff now. So I think that the record of what you do, how you process through all of that, is not that you're going to show them eventually, but then everything makes sense. So I think that thesis is not what you do in September, it's what you did since January to September, and how you archive all of that, and how you think through that, and then you publish it in log or you publish it in somewhere. You know, I could not publish anything, you know, because because of file problems. So any of that at that time, until I got my amazing photograph from Joshua White in 2006 for SCI-Arc Gallery, which was another thing that Eric did, which is to not only do a gallery show, but always hire a professional photographer. This seems like small things, but they made a big difference. You had this amazing show, you spent all this money, time, because, you know, gallery shows at SCI-Arc is not only the money you're giving, you really put a lot of effort and money. So, and then you had no photos of them. It happened a lot, old models, burned down models, like in my case. So having a photograph that can last forever, a file that is an image file that can be printed forever. So anyways, these are like tales, but I think that to Christina's point, I'm not only highly recommend Thesis, I highly recommend Archive. I think Anna is a great example. Everything she did, she put it in a book. You know, like everything was like Archive immediately. You test it, you put it in a book. I think that's fantastic. I'm sure, I mean, these are 10 minutes only, but if you have more time, we could really go over those ideas.
Yeah, for sure. There are many publications also for students where you can submit. So a lot of them are run by, I mean, we have, of course, our own publications at SCI-Arc, but every school has different kind of themes. And as long as, I think this is something very important because everybody is going to finish very soon and we are all thinking about September and the deadline. But also I think we can start thinking about what happens afterwards. And, you know, an internship is one way to move forward, but then there are all kinds of other things like grants and institutions that are public and cities and publications and things that you can write up. And those are other ways in which you can kind of prolong this experience.
So yes, to Elena, I think that archiving format, a future format conversation, you can do like the, what is the role of an archive? Because remember, we're going to do a website and that's one way of archiving. It's not, it won't last forever. So you have to find ways in which you have this, you know, long lasting, you know, format for archiving.
May I ask a question that doesn't have to do so much with the archive? Not that I want to stop the archive conversation, it's interesting as well. But so all three of you have shown work, or all three of you have shown the interapplicable nature of your work, both exploratory and deployable. It's not unlike On a Shrunken Field that fits capital A architecture into it, no matter how small the scene of production gets. But you're all working in scenes of construction as well. And none seem to sacrifice your thesis on your career as architects. Can you talk about staying inspired through your work?
Maybe I'll just jump in and then pass the mic. I stay inspired by everybody I collaborate with. So I'm not sure that it's the work itself, but I think that it's very hard to work in a vacuum. And this is one thing that makes thesis actually quite hard because there is an expectation for a lot of us that it's an individual project, but in many ways, when we finish school, we work collaboratively for the most part. So I even write collaboratively now because I think that that's the only way to kind of move things forward and to open your mind in discussion with other people. So that.
Casey?
Unhealthy compulsion? I don't know. Like, what else would you do? I think staying inspired. I don't think I have an alternative. Like, there's been a lot of points in my career where I was like ready to kind of give up on things. and the various people kind of helped me out to keep, like, I think having a network of people that like find value in your ideas, but also aggressively challenge them is important. You know, I think I think when maybe Marika like first kind of met the discrete group, like, which is a terrible name for like Shields and Jose and myself, like she was shocked at how much we fight and how like angry we were with each other. But I think that that's critical. I think you need people to both like find enough value in your work that they think that they need to challenge it, or that you know that your work has enough consequence that they think that they need to challenge it, but also to tell you why like what you're doing needs to be rethought. I think that like I don't know, maybe it's just like, yeah, I think it's a bit of a compulsion, like the hyper criticality, and I need I think that those kinds of relationships which start at school are the things that can help you to kind of maintain a focus when you start to hit like kind of brick walls on something that you're pursuing. Yeah, I don't know, your network, I guess. I don't understand the idea of not being inspired to kind of pursue your project. Like it might be just excessive obsession, but the idea that you wouldn't be completely obsessed with this project that you're interested in, I can't empathize with. Or I don't know how to help. I wouldn't know how to like help that if you're not.
I think that, Max, thanks for your question. I think that, you know, one thing that it's interesting from this discipline is that it's a design discipline. And even though you know, we learn, you know, you ask, you know, when somebody asks you, do you do commercial or residential? You know, the questions of being an architect, there's a kind of set of rules. And what I find most interesting is that you are a designer, you know, so you can do a landscape project, you can do a chair, and we have the best examples throughout the history of architecture to see that. And you can jump scale in the same month. And so for me, what at least it keeps me inspired is that it might get bored of something, then I can move to something else within the same discipline. So I did like, for many years, I did like 5 years of river in studio and SCI-Arc, five years of river projects, you know, landscape a lot. And then it's like, that's it, no, something smaller. Then I'll be back to river project, then a smaller thing, then I can design a piece of furniture. Been designing furniture for the last year. Maybe now I want to do something bigger. And you know, we're designers, you know, so I mean, my critique sometimes I get, we used to get with Shaki, sometimes it's like, where are all the buildings, you know? Sometimes it jumps from a facade to a small building, to a landscape, to a small piece, to an object. I mean, and I'm considered an architect. I studied plenty years to be an architect. So, you know, so I'm just going to use that. But I can always choose something else to do. And, you know, I could do cutlery if I want to. So I think that it keeps me inspired. If I get bored and uninspired, I'll find something else. Editing magazines, working on books. You know, I'm not a writer, so I wouldn't be writing, but editing, I love choosing images. So I think that so in a way, you know, you guys, you'll find it. And a place like SCI-Arc is amazing because it's very much about creativity. And that's what you will need always, no matter what you do, you'll need creativity.
Maybe to go off of that point, my question is, if you put yourselves back to where we are now, my peers and I were about to graduate at the very beginning of our career, I'm wondering, what was the scope of the things that you thought possible at our stage, just coming out of school and entering into a profession in some degree? And is there something that's changed in the climate now that you see that you would wish had existed in your climate when you were in our position?
Anna?
I would say, hey, Rob, I would say that the field has become, the professional field has become a lot more ethical. When I finished and worked at OMA, we worked probably until 3 in the morning, 4 in the morning, would come back at 9 or 10 to the office. And we did it every day without a break. And we worked a lot. And I do think that a lot of the work that was possible because of the internship programs and the kind of junior designer positions that were taking advantage of the fact that we were so excited to be there and to think of it as a kind of extension of our education. And of course, at least, well, for me at OMA, for sure, working with Rehm Koolhaas, it did feel like very inspiring, but looking back on it, I think it was unhealthy as an environment. And so that's something that I see less and less of. I think a lot more offices, including OMA, are kind of restructuring the way they work. And I think that what you should always demand, even when the economy is terrible, everybody's getting laid off, you should always demand to be paid for your time and to have a healthy kind of schedule and to be, you know, close to the beach or something, close to your family, to have an idea of yourself as somebody who is worthy, and somebody who brings a lot of expertise to the office and a lot of amazing kind of and rich kind of technique and intelligence.
I agree with you, Anna, because I think that that year that I worked for Peter Eisenman's office, I mean, I think I learned a lot and I hated it so much. We would never know when we were going home. We always work on weekends, but there was always some other office that it was worse. I remember, Merceline, maybe you know, Jesse Reiser's office worked until 11 p.m. and work always on the weekends.
3 a.m.
And at least, yeah, and I was getting paid, but over there they were not, and they sleep under, I mean, like, I was like, I'm good. I mean, I leave at 9, 10 p.m. Those guys work all weekend. Sometimes I have weekends off. So I mean, I never believe in that kind of work, you know. And then I work at Greg Lynn's office. I work at Asymptote, and they were, you know, they're wonderful, but they were Canadian, so they didn't trust in the holidays, American holidays. So 4th of July, you had to be at the office, and you know, so you had that kind of stuff that you're like, you're kidding me? Like, today's 4th of July. So no, because we're Canadian, so we don't, you know, we don't follow those same dates. Then I worked for Greg Lynn. Greg was amazing because he was really laid back, you know, close to the beach. And then for Frank Getty, forget it. My life was gone again. No weekends, always all day. That's it. So I'm like, I'm done. I'm like, done. I need a corporate job or no job. But again, you know, like these were all amazing experiences. So I just, you know, from them, I started teaching. So I think that I'm not an example. I mean, I have no answer, Robert, because I probably made all the mistakes that Anna is talking about with my life. And so in all the worst offices, except for some of them, there's always one that is worst, you know, that is longer hours, longer weekends and stuff like that. So I think those times, hopefully they're past, you know, those things don't happen again. But I do think that apprenticeship is really important. I do think that, you know, those things should change, but also there's a certain collegiality that you get with people that change. When I worked for Peter, it was a big office at that time. And then I wanted to go to Columbia, so he was going to help me write a letter. I'm in my apartment, I hear the phone. You know, there used to be phone messages. I didn't have a cell phone. And I had a message from him saying to call him back because he's going to help me to get to school. That was like shocking, you know, that he would, you know. And so I wish I still keep that message. It was really funny. Hey, Florencia, you know, he spoke like Eddie. He speaks like Eddie Moss. So you can imagine that, that kind of tone. And so that was, So I think that, you know, and then I would call him to see what verticals I should take at Columbia and stuff like that. So I do think that yes and no, but it shouldn't be like that. I mean, I shouldn't be waiting until what time I you know, I can get home at 9-10 p.m. So, but I think that that's why I agree with Anna. It has to change the environments, you know, offices. And also it's a tough landscape, you know, look at us, you know, we're always starting over, inventing, trying to get new projects, staying fresh, keeping good ideas, you know, and so I'm not going to lie to you guys. It's a tough discipline, and even now with the COVID stuff, it's even tougher to, you know, to maintain. So you have to kind of find a career path that it works for you in this ensemble of things, in which you always find creativity, but you're always sane. You know, you're keeping it, you know, you're keeping a kind of a clear mind with this stuff.
I also think there's a little bit of similarity between when I graduated from Columbia and you guys graduating. They're different contexts, but like in the same sense that the market is really bad. Like up until grad school, I just assumed I'd be always just working in a standard architecture office. Like I was also doing the 100-hour weeks prior to that, and then actually I do too many of them for myself anyways. But but what happened, you know, like after I graduated, I think there were 75 students in my class, and we kind of kept track of this. There were 6 students that had jobs in New York in the first year. And I was one of them, but I was working 5 different jobs in order to kind of put things together. But it's not like I don't want this to become like oh no, like this is going to be really scary and awful. I think the critical thing was like something that had been something I had been doing as a kind of pet project at night, and I always thought was going to be some kind of thing that would be folding into architecture, became the way that I was able to kind of redefine my career and gave me the kind of stability and agency over it to basically, you know, stay in New York at the time, which was tough, right? But also opened up a bunch of different doors. So the types of projects that I started to take on based on my interests actually allowed me to have a kind of career when there weren't, you know, like I went from being kind of project manager type person to being paid like a junior designer or an intern after grad school. So these other things that were like I thought were just kind of personal pursuits or interests became like viable ways of getting agency back out in the world, like moving into data viz and moving into simulation. So I think like you guys, you know, anytime there's a kind of crisis like this, it's very valuable to start to reconsider like what context your individual pursuits and interests can start to give you leverage on the rest of the world, right? Or allow you to kind of govern the direction that you want to take over the next couple of years. Like even if kind of option A isn't there, like what other ways can you kind of reshape a career for yourself that fits your agendas? And then you eat a lot of ramen. That was the other thing that happened.
Robert, I hope we didn't sound too depressing, but there's always some, you know, crisis, you know, after school. So, you know, I think that you guys, this is going to be a tough one, but, you know, as I think Anna mentioned, you know, sometimes, you know, there's some level of creativity comes through, you know, in those moments, you know, when things suddenly change so much, so drastically. So if there's no further questions, oh yeah, there. Thank you, Christy.
Not a question, just a thank you.
Thank you for joining. If there's no final questions, you know, I'd like to thank you guys. It was fun to chat, to do a travel machine, time travel machine, and test the 10 minutes. And for another time, I will have to kind of revisit this and make it a bit longer. But you know, the idea is that, you know, we have more time, you know, we'll speak more. So, you know, this is what you guys will see. That's the role of the architect. So thanks everybody. And yeah, and see you on Friday for live chat.
Thanks,
Bye,
everybody.
guys. Thank you.
everyone.
Yeah, bye. Thanks, everyone. See you later.